So hey there. So for the next reading in my Spooky Read series, I'm turning to a short story. I'm going to read to you tonight from The Monkey's Paw by W. W. Jacobs, which is a story that was first published in 1902. So as I'm trying to choose pieces to do for this Spooky Read series, I'm finding that I'm choosing a lot of stuff that I read when I was a kid. And, I don't know, maybe I'm just harder to scare now that I'm older. But when I think back about the things that really spooked or scared me, I'm coming up with a lot of things that I read when I was somewhere between like 8 and 13 years old. And part of this, I think, is that there's something magic about that time of life where the things that you read and watch and love at that time really become deep-seated in your heart. They become part of who you are. And this story is definitely one of those for me. So if you don't know The Monkey's Paw already, it's in the public domain, so easy to get a copy of and to read. And I first read this story in school. I can't remember the classroom context at all, but I do remember that it was one of those few moments where every kid in the class was enraptured with the story. That, it's pretty rare to be able to capture a whole room full of kids with reading because some of them don't like to read or they haven't found the right thing yet. But this story, we were all like on the edge of our seats for. And it's kind of the quintessential be careful what you wish for kind of story. So I'm going to read a few different snippets from the beginning to give you a taste of it. So this is at the very beginning when the visitor arrives who brings the monkey paw with him. And I think it's just a beautiful bit of setting. The little description that we get of the Sergeant Major Morris kind of gives you a lot. The old man rose with hospitable haste, and opening the door was heard condoling with the new arrival. The new arrival also condoled with himself, so that Mrs. White said, "Tut, tut," and coughed gently as her husband entered the room, followed by a tall, burly man, beady of eye and rubicund of visage. "Sergeant Major Morris," he said, introducing him. The sergeant major shook hands, and taking the preferred seat by the fire, watched contentedly while his host got out whiskey and tumblers and stood a small kettle on the fire. At the third glass, his eyes got brighter, and he began to talk, the little family circle regarding with eager interest this visitor from distant parts, as he squared his broad shoulders in the chair and spoke of strange scenes and doughty deeds, of wars and plagues and strange peoples. So, this person who's had a more exciting life comes and he has with him the monkey's paw. And I understood this literally to be a monkey's paw, like a paw off of a monkey that is kind of mummified. And he's been carrying it around, and he tells them that it grants wishes. So this is the group of them talking to him about the monkey's paw. "Well, why don't you have 3, sir?" said Herbert White cleverly. The soldier regarded him in that way middle age is wont to regard presumptuous youth. "I have," he said quietly, and his blotchy face whitened. "And did you really have the 3 wishes granted?" asked Mrs. White. "I did," said the sergeant major, and his glass tapped against his strong teeth. "And has anybody else wished?" inquired the old lady. "The first man had 3 wishes, yes," was the reply. "I don't know what the first 2 were, but the third was for death, and that is how I got the paw." Now, somebody tells me this story, I'm going nowhere near that paw. But, of course, they don't believe it. And so a little bit later, the father makes a wish, and he wishes for 200 pounds, which is a substantial but not insane amount of money, right? So here's the bit where he makes his wish. "I wish for 200 pounds, said the old man distinctly. A fine crash from the piano greeted the words, interrupted by a shuddering cry from the old man. His wife and son ran toward him. "It moved," he cried, with a glance of disgust at the object as it lay on the floor. "As I wished, it twisted in my hands like a snake." Ah! Bad enough, huh? So now we move to when the wish is granted. I'm cutting a little bit here and there just to give you the highlights. So a stranger arrives at the house, and the wife notices and goes out to get him from the garden. And so I'll start with where she brings the stranger inside the house. She brought the stranger, who seemed ill at ease, into the room. He gazed at her furtively and listened in a preoccupied fashion as the old lady apologized for the appearance of the room and her husband's coat, a garment which he usually reserved for the garden. She then waited as patiently as her sex would permit for him to broach his business, but he was at first strangely silent. "I was asked to call," he said at last, and stooped and picked a piece of cotton from his trousers. "I come from Ma and Megan's." The old lady started. "Is anything the matter?" she asked breathlessly. "Has anything happened to Herbert?" "What is it? What is it?" Her husband interposed. "There, there, mother," he said hastily. "Sit down and don't jump to conclusions. You've not brought bad news, I'm sure, sir." And he eyed the other wistfully. "I'm sorry," began the visitor. "Is he hurt?" demanded the mother. The visitor bowed in assent. "Badly hurt," he said quietly, "but he is not in any pain." "Oh, thank God," said the old woman, clasping her hands. "Thank God for that. Thank—" She broke off suddenly as the sinister meaning of the assurance dawned upon her, and she saw the awful confirmation of her fears in the other's averted face. She caught her breath, and turning to her slower-witted husband, laid her trembling hand upon his. There was a long silence. "He was caught in the machinery," said the visitor at length, in a low voice. "Caught in the machinery," repeated Mr. White, in a dazed fashion. "Yes." He was staring blankly out the window, and taking his wife's hand between his own, pressed it as he'd been wont to do in their old courting days, nearly 40 years before. "He was the only one left to us," he said, turning gently to the visitor. "It is hard." The other coughed, and rising walked slowly to the window. "The firm wished me to convey their sincere sympathy with you in your great loss," he said, without looking around. "I beg that you will understand that I am only their servant, and merely obeying orders." There was no reply. The old woman's face was white, her eyes staring, and her breath inaudible. On the husband's face was such a look such as his friend the sergeant might have carried into his first action. "I was to say that Ma and Megan's disclaim all responsibility," continued the other. "They admit no liability at all, but in consideration of your son's services, they wish to present you with a certain sum as compensation." Mr. White dropped his wife's hand, and rising to his feet, gazed with a look of horror on the visitor. His dry lips shaped the words, "How much?" £200, was the answer. Unconscious of his wife's shriek, the old man smiled faintly, put out his hands like a sightless man, and dropped, a senseless heap, to the floor. Now, there are 2 more wishes in this story, and if you don't already know the story, I strongly encourage you to go read the whole thing. Like I said, it's in the public domain. You can just Google Monkey's Paw, probably even just Monkey's Paw, but the author's name is W. Jacobs, and it was published in 1902, if there's any doubt that you've got the right story. And it's not very long. It won't take you very long to read. But that story really got me in that that way that the sudden changes and changes in expectation can get you, in that ironic, the universe works in mysterious ways kind of thing. So just, it's a good idea. Go check this one out. The first, or maybe the very first, be careful what you wish for kind of story. It's a good one. Happy Halloween.